So now we're going to look at anaerobic respiration, right? So before we learned about different types of cellular respiration where it involves oxygen, anaerobic is when there's an absence of oxygen, right? So again, it all begins with the specific metabolite that was created from the process of glycolysis called pyruvate, right? So you remember from before, from during glycolysis, glucose goes in the cytoplasm. You have all these different kind of metabolic glycolytic enzymes that converts glucose to pyruvate in the process of glycolysis, right? And due to the lack of any kind of membrane-bound organelles, some cells go through this physiological process called anaerobic respiration, right? So pyruvate does not get converted to acetylcholine because there is no mitochondria, right? So in the essence, now we're looking at actually converting pyruvate into a certain metabolite for any kind of metabolic processes, right? So when we look at anaerobic respiration, the first chemical that comes to mind is the starting product, the substrate, pyruvate. So again, we learn that pyruvate comes from the actual glycolysis and the breakdown of glucose. So pyruvate here now, because it does not get shunted to the mitochondria for the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, here it remains in the cytoplasm and it gets converted into this new byproduct called lactate or lactic acid. Lactic acid helps for the recycling of certain metabolic enzymes that were used in the glycolysis, right? So the enzyme involved with this conversion of pyruvate to lactate is called lactate dehydrogenase, right? And this enzyme converts this reduced form of NADH, so NADH plus H plus, right, back into NAD positive. And this NAD positive gets recycled back into glycolysis for the region where we saw the conversion of the glyceraldehyde 3 phosphate into 1,3-biphosphate, right? So again, it goes back into glycolysis as a recycling mechanism here, all right? Now, this becomes a certain kind of physiological phenomenon where a lot of cells in our bodies that do not have these membrane-bound organelles, for example, our red blood cells, so red blood cells, white blood cells, certain cells in our kidneys, medullary kidneys, right? So all of these cells do not have this actual standard cellular respiration where the pyruvate goes into the mitochondria to generate these different forms of ATP. However, they go through this pathway, the lactic acid pathway, right? And this can be induced, right? So for example, I went to the gym with my dad, and my dad never worked out in his life. He's 70 years old. And he, for example, started doing a little bit of curling. He's trying to get a little bigger. I don't know what he's trying to think about at the age of 70, but maybe he's going through a 3/4 life crisis or something like that. No idea what's going on in his head. And he noticed after the workout, he saw this hypertrophy of his muscles. His muscles felt fantastic, right? He said, I never felt my muscles be this strong before, right? And the next day he woke up and he said, ow, my biceps hurt so much. I wish I never did that. And why did you do this to me? Why did you not warn me? And I kind of gave him a little warning in the beginning, but if I told him the real truth, then he wouldn't have worked out, right? So I cared about his health, right? Those muscles specifically is due to the buildup of lactic acid, right? And this lactic acid pathway is an anaerobic pathway. So any kind of bodybuilders that go out and work out or any kind of exercise that you do, that soreness you'd feel is due to the buildup of lactic acid, right? So all of these high intensity exercises, anaerobic exercises, utilizes this pathway in order to recycle this NAD positive to continue this glycolysis to take place, right? And so what's really important is these ratios. So when we look at these specific ratios, you have this NADH to NAD positive ratios, right? So we're looking at these ratios here, okay? When we have a very low NADH to NAD positive ratio, all right, this causes the lactic acid. Basically, the whole purpose of this is to show the direction of where everything is going, right? So remember, this process, what's unique about it is, if you didn't catch that in the beginning, this is a reversible process, right? And so when we want to look at the differences of whether lactic acid is produced or pyruvate is being produced is based off of these chemicals here, right? And so if there is a low NADH to NAD positive ratio, meaning, what does that mean whenever you see these ratios? Well, there's less NADH in compared to the NAD positive. This reverse reaction occurs. So you have more pyruvate production. So pyruvate is being produced. So there's an oxidation step that takes place where lactic acid is oxidized, so the hydrogens are removed and pyruvate is created. So you have a increase in pyruvate production, right? So this decrease, right? Vice versa, if you have an increase in this NADH to NAD positive ratio, this process leads to the pyruvate becoming more reduced. So this reduction. And so now you have an actually excess production of lactate. All right. And so this is just a general idea of how anaerobic respiration takes place and the different ratios and where it happens in the body, right? So you see it in these specific cells that are present, red blood cells, white blood cells. What else? In your gut microbiome, when we look at the microbiome here, it's really prevalent where you have a high presence of these bacteria. So in the gut microbiome. And so what's unique about the microbiome now is that rather than being the pyruvate being converted to lactate, pyruvate actually gets converted to ethanol. So ethanol is another type of alcohols, right? So all of this happens during an anaerobic response because there is no membrane-bound organelle that we need, specifically the mitochondria, in order to produce some kind of respiratory response with the utilization of oxygen. So no oxygen, anaerobic. Oxygen present, aerobic.